The snow had no mercy left in it by the time I reached the ridge. It came sideways, the way it always did in the high peaks above Asheville, not falling so much as flinging itself against whatever dared stand upright. I was used to it. I've been walking this particular stretch of the Thornwood border since I was 12 years old enough to carry a lantern and young enough that the pack elders believed the cold would harden me. It had. Or so I told myself, pulling my wool cloak tighter and bending my head into the gust. My name is Senna. I am Omega ranked in the Asheville pack. That means I am the last thing anyone thinks of when they think of wolves. It means I carry the firewood and the water. It means I walk patrol routes that no ranked wolf would bother with, the outer edges, the frost-stiffened paths no one uses after first snowfall, because there is nothing out there but pine and wind, and the occasional territorial marker that hasn't been refreshed in 2 years. It means I sleep in the servant quarters of the pack house and eat what's left after the ranked wolves have taken their fill. It means that when I am afraid, I stay quiet about it, because no one is listening anyway. I wasn't afraid that night. I was cold and tired and thinking about the bowl of stew I'd left sitting on the hearth back in my room, and whether the fire would have kept it warm or whether I'd come home to a skin of cold broth and another hungry night. That was when I heard it. Not a sound you could have named exactly. More a vibration, something beneath the howl of the wind, beneath the creak of the pines. My wolf stirred before I consciously registered it, the way she sometimes did when the forest was telling us something we weren't clever enough to understand yet. I stopped. The lantern's flame pressed sideways in the gust. I lifted it higher and turned, scanning the tree line on my left, where the pines grew dense and black, and the snow had drifted in deep against their roots. Nothing. And then again, the smallest sound, a thin, ragged pulse of breath almost swallowed by the wind. I left the path. That was the thing they'd have told me not to do had any ranked wolf been present. Stay on the patrol line, Senna. Don't wander. Don't waste time. An Omega's job is to observe and report, not to investigate. But there was no ranked wolf present, and the sound pulled at something old in me, something maternal and fierce that had never quite had anywhere to go. I pushed through the last stand of pine and found her. A baby. She was lying in the snow at the base of an oak so old its roots had grown above ground, curling up like thick, gnarled fingers. Someone had laid her in the hollow between 2 roots, wrapped in a cloak that was already stiff with ice at the edges. She was so still I thought for a single terrible moment that I'd come too late, and then she breathed, a hitching little exhale that misted in the lantern light, and I was already moving. I didn't think. I reached into the hollow and lifted her out, pressing her against my chest, wrapping my cloak around us both. She was so cold, so impossibly cold, the kind of cold that meant minutes, not hours. Her face was pale in the lantern light, lips tinged a faint blue, small fingers curled against her chest like she'd been trying to hold onto something. Her eyes opened. Dark, darker than they had any right to be on a baby this small, this new. She looked at me with the focused, ancient gravity that very young infants sometimes have, as though she was measuring me and had already decided something. I felt at the moment our eyes met. It started at the base of my throat, a heat, sudden and specific, moving upward along the left side of my neck. I gasped. It wasn't pain exactly, but it was pressure and intention, and I had the wild, irrational sense that something was being written on me. The baby made a small sound, not a cry, just a breath, like a question answered, and the heat bloomed fully onto the left side of my neck and settled there. I pressed 2 fingers to my skin. A raised mark, warm to the touch. I knew what it was. Every wolf in every pack in every territory knew the legend of the Alpha King's mark. It was the oldest story we told, older than territory lines, older than pack law. The mark of the Alpha King, given not by his hand but by the moon herself, appearing on the skin of the one he was meant to claim. The mate mark, the bond seal. a thing most of us believed the way we believed in childhood stories, with a kind of fond distance that kept us from having to take it seriously. I stood in the snow, holding a dying baby against my chest, with the Alpha King's mark burning on my neck, and laughed. It was a single, short, helpless sound, because what else was there to do? I pulled the cloak tighter and started walking back toward the packhouse at a run. The packhouse physician was a gruff woman named Marin who had delivered more pups than she could count and had opinions about everything. Most of them delivered in the flat, certain tones of someone who had long since stopped caring whether her opinions were welcome. She examined the baby with brisk efficiency while I stood dripping snowmelt onto the stone floor. "Found her in the thornwood," I said. "In the roots of an oak past the second bend. She was." I can see what she was. Marin was warming the baby's hands between her own, watching the color return to those tiny fingers with an expression I recognized as professional concentration masking deep concern. "How long do you think she was out there?" "I don't know. The snow around her wasn't disturbed, so a while, long enough." Marin grunted. "She's alive, strong heartbeat considering whatever she is, she's stubborn." She looked up at me. "Whatever she is, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Come look at this." I leaned over her shoulder. The baby had settled, her color returning in small increments, her chest rising and falling with a steadiness that I'd been praying for since the moment I found her. "Smell her," Marin said. I did. Not wolf, not human. Something older than both, layered and complex in a way that made my own wolf go still and alert, ears metaphorically pricked. The baby smelled of pine resin and deep water and something mineral and cold that I could not name, and beneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, the particular resonance of high-blooded wolf. Very high-blooded wolf. "She's from the Alpha King's line," Marin said quietly. It wasn't a question. I touched the mark on my neck without thinking. Marin's eyes tracked the movement, and her expression shifted. The first time in the years I'd known her that I'd seen something that might have been genuine surprise on her face. "Senna, I know. That's who. I know Marin." She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked at the baby, then she looked back at me. "Does anyone else know about the mark?" "No." "Keep it that way," she said, and her voice had gone from surprising to flat again, the voice of a woman making a decision. "For now, until we know what she is and why she was left, the mark is yours to keep quiet. The Alpha King's court is not a forgiving place for Omegas who make claims." "I'm not making any claim. The mark is making it for you." She wrapped the baby more firmly in a dry, warming cloth and laid her in the small cot she kept in the examination room for pups who needed overnight watching. "I'll keep her here tonight. Tomorrow we'll need to start asking questions. Someone left this child deliberately, and deliberately means someone knows something." I nodded. I was still cold, and my stew was almost certainly beyond saving by now, and the mark on my neck had settled into a low, steady warmth that I didn't know what to do with. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. Her name, it turned out, was Lysa. Not a name anyone gave her, a name Marin discovered 3 days later when an exhausted woman arrived at the Asheville Pack gates at dawn, wrapped in a cloak of a quality that had no business being worn this far into borderlands. She was thin-faced and frightened, and she gave her name as Etta, a servant, she said, from the Alpha King's court, and she had been walking for 4 days. I was in the courtyard when she arrived, carrying a load of firewood. I watched Pack Alpha Drav intercept her, watched the brief and quiet conversation that followed, watched Drav's expression shift from disinterest to something carefully neutral. Then Drav looked across the courtyard at me, and my stomach dropped. "Senna." I set down the firewood. The room was small, and Etta's hands shook around the cup of tea Marin had given her. She was perhaps 30, though she looked older. Drav sat at the table's head with his beta, Orlin and Marin stood near the window, and I sat where I'd been put in the chair across from Etta, which felt pointed. "Tell her what you told me," Drav said to Etta. Etta looked at me with the expression of someone who had rehearsed something many times and was now uncertain of every word. "The child, Lysa, she is the Alpha King's daughter." The room was very quiet. "His only daughter," Etta continued. "Her mother died in the birth. The king, she stopped, pressed her lips together. There are people in the court who would see her dead. They have been working against the king for years now. Advisors, old blood wolves who believe a female heir weakens the line. They tried 3 times in the first week of her life. The fourth time, they got into the nursery." "Who got her out?" Marin asked. Etta looked at her hands. "I did. I took her out through the servant passages. I ran for 4 days. I chose Asheville because it's far from the court roads. Because I hoped." "Why leave her in the snow?" I asked. I hadn't meant to speak, but the question came out before I could catch it, and the room turned toward me. "Why not knock on the gate?" Etta's eyes met mine. I was followed. I could hear them on the last night. I was afraid that if I came to the gate, they would see me and know where she was. "I hid her in the oldest place I could find, the oak trees on the ridge boundary. They are warded, old growth warded. I believe she would be safe there long enough for—" She stopped again. "I didn't know someone would find her in the night." I thought about the sound beneath the wind, the vibration that had turned me off the path. I did not say anything about that. "The king," Drav said very carefully, "does he know she's alive?" "No," Etta whispered. "No one knows she's alive." Drav was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the people who want her dead, they're still looking." It wasn't a question either. The room had a particular weight to it now, the kind that settles in when every person present has understood the same thing at the same moment. A baby in the pack house. Enemies already hunting her. And the Alpha King's mark sitting on the neck of an Omega who had no power, no rank, no standing to be in any part of this story. Drav looked at me again. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen directed at me before, not warmth, exactly, but weight, recognition. "She found the child," Marin said before Drav could speak. "Lysa found her, or chose her, which in this case amounts to the same thing." I touched my neck. The mark had been there for 3 days, and it still surprised me every time, the warmth of it, the steadiness, like a coal banked low and patient. Drav drew a slow breath. "Then we have a choice. We can send word to the king, which means court roads, which means the people hunting Lysa learn she's alive before the message arrives. Or we keep quiet and keep her safe, until we can find a way to reach the king that doesn't run through the court." "Or," Orlin said, and his voice was uncomfortable, "we return the child to whoever is searching for her, and let the court politics sort themselves out." The silence that followed that suggestion was the particular kind of silence that means no. "She stays," I said. I hadn't planned to say that either, but the room accepted it, and I understood that this was how it had been arranged, not by any of us, but by the mark on my neck and the baby sleeping in Marin's examination room, and the moon who apparently found the concept of Omega-ranked politics very funny. "She stays," Drav agreed. "And Senna, you should—" He paused, weighing something. "You should show Orlin the mark." I turned my collar down. Orlin went still. Drav was already still. Etta made a small, soft sound and pressed both hands over her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears. "The moon chose," Marin said simply into the silence. "They came on the 6th day. 3 of them, in the livery of a courthouse I didn't recognize, good horses, good weapons, and the specific kind of confidence that comes with being used to having authority arrive before you do. They came to the main gate and asked, in the polished tones of the well-connected, whether the Asheville pack had encountered anything unusual in the Thornwood in recent days. I was watching from the upper window of the servant wing, Lysa in my arms. She had decided, in the 6 days since I brought her in from the snow, that I was the only acceptable person to hold her. She tolerated Marin. She regarded everyone else with the ancient, measuring gravity of her dark eyes and frequently expressed displeasure at a volume that surprised people. In my arms, she was quiet. She wrapped her small hand around my finger and held on, and the warmth of the mark on my neck pulsed in a way I was beginning to recognize as something like contentment. Drav met them at the gate himself. He was good at this, the careful, slightly dim-seeming neutrality of a pack alpha who presided over borderlands far from court politics and had opinions mostly about timber and territorial boundaries. He told them nothing had been found. He offered them hospitality, which they declined. He watched them ride away with the polished pleasantness of a man who has given nothing away. Then he came to find me. "They'll be back," he said. He looked at Lysa, who looked back at him with the expression she reserved for people who weren't me, appraising, slightly imperial. "She really did choose you. She's a baby. She hasn't chosen anything. She's just..." "Senna." He said my name with a gentleness that surprised me, coming from him. "I have been Pack Alpha for 16 years. I have never seen a mating mark appear on an unmated wolf. I have never seen an unclaimed Omega hold an Alpha King's heir without the child screaming. And I have never in my life seen 3 court wolves ride for 4 days into border territory for a routine inquiry." He paused. "Something is unfolding here that is larger than Asheville. I need to know, and I need you to know, whether you are willing to be in the middle of it." I looked down at Lysa. She had gone back to holding my finger. There were ice crystal scars on the tips of 3 of her fingers, frostbite marks that Marin had treated that would fade in time but hadn't yet. They were smaller than anything I'd ever seen. "I already am," I said. Drav nodded. "Then we send word to the king, carefully, through a path that doesn't touch court roads." He looked uncomfortable. "There's a border treaty meeting in 12 days. The Alpha King will be at Keld Ridge, neutral ground, no court intermediaries. If we can get you and the child there." "Me? You're the one with the mark." I stared at him. "I'm the pack's firewood carrier." "You're the wolf the moon chose." He said it with the flat simplicity of someone stating a geographical fact. That has a tendency to rearrange prior categories. I didn't have an answer to that. I sat with Lysa, who had fallen asleep against my chest, her small fist still curled around my finger, and I thought about 12 days and Keld Ridge, and an Alpha King who didn't know his daughter was alive. The journey to Keld Ridge took 9 days. Drav sent 2 of his best warriors with me, Petra and Sel, both mid-ranked wolves who said little, and moved through the forest with the efficient quiet of people who had spent years not calling attention to themselves. We traveled off-road, through the Thornwood, and then the long highlands above it, skirting the court roads entirely. We slept in the open, rotation watches, fire only when necessary. Lysa was, as a travel companion, both more and less difficult than I'd anticipated. She disliked the cold and said so. She disliked staying still and said that too. She slept deeply and completely when I was warm and she was pressed against me, and woke with an affronted fury at dawn that seemed pointed at the universe for having the audacity to end the night. She was, Petra observed on day 3, clearly already planning to run things. I fed her the goat's milk and soft foods Marin had packed, carried her in the sling when the terrain was difficult, and talked to her quietly during the long stretches of walking the way you talk to someone you aren't sure can understand you, but suspect might be listening more carefully than they're letting on. I told her about the pack house and about the patrol routes, and about the particular quality of the pine forest at dawn, when the frost was still on everything, and the light came through at angles. I didn't tell her about her father. I didn't have the words for that yet. On the 5th day, Sel stopped on a ridge and went still in a way that meant something. "We're being tracked," he said quietly. 2 wolves, steady pace behind us, maybe half a mile. I didn't ask how he knew. I tightened the sling around Lysa. "The court horses." "Different, these are on foot." We moved faster after that, adjusting the route, crossing water twice to break the scent. The following presence kept pace with us through the afternoon and lost us, eventually, in the rocky highland above the second river crossing, or lost us clearly enough that by nightfall Sel was willing to call it clear. But I didn't sleep well. On the 8th night, camped in a shallow hollow with a pine bough windbreak and a fire small enough to be arguable, I sat with Lysa after her midnight feeding and watched the dark beyond the firelight and understood something that had been forming slowly since the night in the snow. Whatever I had been before this, Omega-ranked, invisible, the wolf who carried wood and walked patrol routes no one valued, I wasn't that anymore. Not because the mark had elevated me by any formal measure. I had no rank, no standing, no power that any pack council would recognize. But I was sitting here in the dark holding the Alpha King's daughter, with his mark on my neck and 2 capable wolves at my back, and I was not frightened. Careful, yes, alert, yes, but not frightened. I had spent a great deal of my life being afraid, and I hadn't noticed until it started going away. Lysa opened her eyes and looked at me. "I know," I said quietly. "I don't know what comes next either." She appeared to consider this and find it acceptable. She closed her eyes again. Keld Ridge in midwinter was a place of gray stone and frozen grass, elevated above the tree line, exposed to every direction, with the particular strip-clean quality of places that don't bother to be beautiful. The treaty meeting grounds were a cluster of long, low stone buildings around a central fire pit, built generations ago for exactly this purpose, neutral ground, accessible to multiple territories, not owned by anyone important enough to make the meeting political before it started. We arrived in early morning, still 2 hours before the meeting parties were expected. Petra and Sel established a watching point on the upper ridge. I brought Lysa into the largest of the stone buildings and waited by the fire. I had thought about what I would say. I had thought about it for 9 days across 2 river crossings and the better part of a highland range. I had gone through a dozen versions and abandoned all of them, because none of them solved the fundamental problem, which was that I was an Omega with no standing about to walk up to an Alpha King and tell him his daughter was alive, and also the moon had apparently decided I was his fated mate, and I had no idea how a person said any of that without sounding either delusional or presumptuous or both. I heard him before I saw him. His boots on the stone outside, and the particular quality of the air shifting as he came through the door, the barometric pressure change that very high alpha wolves carry with them, the thing that makes lower-ranked wolves want to lower their eyes and slow their breathing. My own wolf went very still. I didn't lower my eyes. He stopped in the doorway. Alpha King Kaelan was not what I had expected, which told me a great deal about how much I'd built up the expectation. He was tall, yes, and the authority he carried was genuine and immediate and not performed. But he was also tired. Not physically tired. The kind of tired that lives in the jaw and the set of the shoulders and the particular flatness behind the eyes of someone who has been holding grief at a distance for too long. He was perhaps 32. He was alone, which was unexpected, and he was looking at Lysa. I watched his face. He had not known she was alive. Whatever Etta had hoped, whatever any of us had believed about messages sent ahead, he had not known. I watched the knowledge arrive in him like something breaking, very carefully, very quietly, behind every trained line of his expression. His jaw tightened. His hands at his sides made a single involuntary movement toward her. "Is she?" His voice came out wrong. He stopped, steadied himself. "Is she well?" Yes, my voice held. I was grateful for that. She had frostbite on 3 fingers. Marin, the Asheville physician, treated it. She's been well for a week. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of me, looking down at Lysa, who looked up at him with the measuring, imperial gravity she turned on everyone, and then did something she had not done with anyone else. She reached up both hands. Kaelan's breath left him. He took her very carefully, and I watched the held grief in his jaw and shoulders do something complicated. Not release, exactly, but shift, some part of it becoming present rather than distant. He held his daughter against his chest and stood very still, and the silence in the stone room was the kind you don't interrupt. After a long time he looked at me. He saw the mark. I hadn't covered it. I'd made the decision somewhere on the Highland Ridge that I wasn't going to hide it, and this was the exact moment that decision was being tested. I held very still. His eyes moved from the mark to my face. Omega-ranked, he said, not unkindly, a statement of what he was reading from me. Yes. From Asheville. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The border patrol who found her. Yes. And the mark? I didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that wasn't obvious. He looked at it for a long time. He was holding Lysa against his shoulder, and she had one hand pressed flat against his jaw, exploring, with the focused interest she brought to everything new. He let her. I don't know what to do with this, he said finally. It was so honest and so unexpected that something in me shifted. He wasn't dismissing it. He wasn't threatening me or managing me or doing any of the things I'd spent 9 days steeling myself for. He was standing in a stone room with his daughter and a stranger, and saying plainly that he was as unprepared as I was. Neither do I said. He looked at me then, really looked, for the first time, not at the mark or at the Omega ranking or at the context, but at me. I don't know what he saw. Probably someone trail-worn and tired and still snow-scented, with a healing nick on my left hand from where I'd caught the edge of a pine branch on the highland, and the look of someone who has been managing on stubbornness for 9 days and is now just barely beginning to let that go. She wouldn't stop crying, he said, unexpectedly. For the first 4 days after her mother died, the nurses said it was normal. I sat with her every night and she would only go quiet if I was holding her. Then she stopped crying and He stopped. Then she was gone, I said carefully. Then she was gone. He adjusted Lysa slightly. She had, with royal disregard for the complexity of the moment, fallen asleep. I was told she died in the attempt to move her. I was told. He stopped again. The flatness behind his eyes had become something else. Not grief and not rage, but the particular quality of a person reassessing every fixed point they'd been navigating by. Someone in my own court tried to kill her. Yes. And someone in your pack chose to send an unmated Omega alone across a highland range to tell me. They didn't send me alone, and I chose to come. I said it before I thought about it and then had to decide whether to qualify it. I didn't. She was left in the snow on a route I walk alone. Something made me leave the path. I found her. The mark came when I touched her. I don't know what any of that means in the formal sense, but she was mine to bring back, so I did. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't categorize. Drav said you're the pack's. Firewood carrier, patrol route walker, Omega. I said it levelly. Yes. He looked at the mark again. I'm not claiming anything, I said. I want to be clear about that. The mark appeared. I didn't ask for it. I came here because you needed to know your daughter was alive and because there were people hunting her and it seemed like the right thing to do. What happens with, I gestured carefully at my own neck, that's not a conversation I came here to have. That's a conversation for later or not at all, or Senna. He knew my name. I suppose Drav had sent word ahead, somewhere in the 9 days. The fact that he used it with the same plain directness he'd used everything else made it land differently than it should have. Yes. I've been Alpha King for 7 years. I have had every advantage of rank and blood and political positioning my entire life. I have had advisors and court protocol and the weight of history to tell me what every situation means and how to navigate it. That sounds useful. It is. He looked down at Lysa, sleeping against his shoulder. I have no protocol for this. I have no advisors I currently trust. I have a daughter who was left for dead in the snow and found by the wolf the moon apparently decided to mark. He paused. I'm telling you that because you said you weren't claiming anything, and I think you need to know that I'm not approaching this as a claim either. I'm approaching it as a man who has been getting a great number of things wrong for a considerable amount of time and would like, for once, to get something right. The fire popped between us. Outside, the wind had picked up the way it does at altitude, a purposeful, directional sound, like the highland itself acknowledging something. I thought about standing in the snow in the thornwood dark, holding a baby I'd found by following a sound beneath the wind. I thought about 9 days of frost in Highland, and the slow fading of the particular fear that had lived in me so long I'd thought it was just the shape of me. She needs to be kept safe, I said. It was where I started because it was what I knew. Yes. The court. You need to know who in the court tried to kill her before you bring her back. Yes. And Etta, the woman who carried her out. I don't know where she is now. Petra said she saw her turning north before we left Asheville. I'll find her. His voice had that particular quality of the certain, not arrogance, but the deep matter-of-fact authority of someone who has spent enough years with power that the certainty has become native rather than performed. She'll be protected. And the people hunting Lysa, the ones who have been following us for the last 4 days. His eyes sharpened. Following you from Asheville. Sel thought so. We lost them on the Highland crossing, but... He moved to the door in 3 clean strides, and the air pressure in the room shifted again. The true Alpha Command resonance now, undiluted, the thing that makes every instinct in a lower-ranked wolf want to freeze. My wolf held steady. I found this interesting. He called something to the people outside. His own wolves, I realized, who'd been keeping distance at the ridge, and 2 of them separated from wherever they'd been watching and moved fast down the slope. He came back to the doorway and looked at me. You weren't afraid, he said. Of your command pressure, I considered this, a little, but not enough to move. He was quiet for a moment. That's unusual. I know. The mark. Maybe. Or maybe I thought about the patrol routes, the firewood, the cold stew, the long accumulation of small indignities that had somehow burned away into something tougher and less ornamental. Maybe I was always going to be hard to move. It just took the right circumstances to find out. He looked at me for a long time. Lysa chose this moment to wake up. She did it the way she always did, from deep sleep to full alert in approximately 2 seconds, dark eyes open and already assessing. She looked at her father, in whose arms she'd been sleeping. She looked at me. She made the small, demanding sound that meant she wanted me, which she had made consistently since the 2nd day in Marin's examination room. Kaelen looked down at his daughter, who was reaching for me with the imperious certainty of someone for whom logistics were other people's problem. Something crossed his face, something that wasn't grief or authority or the careful management of a man used to controlling his expression, something simpler and younger and almost surprised by itself. She does that with you, he said. She does it constantly. She did it to Drav, and he looked genuinely startled. She hasn't, he stopped, started again. She reached for me when I first held her. Before that she reached for no one. She has opinions, I said, very strong ones. About everything. He transferred her to me carefully. Lysa settled against my chest with the immediate, absolute satisfaction of someone whose wishes have finally been correctly addressed. The mark on my neck pulsed once, warm. Kaelen was close now. The transfer of Lysa had required proximity, and he hadn't stepped back. I could feel the heat of him and the careful stillness of someone being deliberate about where they put their attention. I want to bring you to the court, he said quietly. You and Lysa, he paused. I'm asking. I want to be clear that I'm asking, not requiring. The mark doesn't. I know what the mark means, and I know what it doesn't mean, and I'm not going to collapse those two things together and call it resolution. He met my eyes. But I'd like the chance to get this right, if you're willing. I thought about what Marin had said. The Alpha King's Court is not a forgiving place for Omegas who make claims. I thought about standing in the snow with a lantern and following a sound beneath the wind. I thought about 12 days in a highland range and the fading of an old fear. I have conditions, I said. He didn't flinch. Tell me. Etta is found and protected before we set foot on a court road. Agreed. The wolves who have been following us, I want to know who sent them before I'm anywhere near court walls. Agreed. And Petro and Cell, my pack escort, they come in with us, not left at the border, in. He nodded. Agreed. I looked at him, he looked back. Lysa, between us, had gone back to exploring my collar with the focused interest she brought to everything, making small sounds of investigation. And one more thing, I said. Yes. When I said I'm not claiming anything, I meant it at the time, but I want you to know that not claiming and not wanting aren't necessarily the same thing. I said it plainly, the way you say things when you've spent enough years being made small that you've lost the patience for anything less than direct. The mark appeared. It appeared on me. I'm not pretending I don't know what that means. He was quiet then. Neither am I. The fire between us had burned down to good coals, the steady kind, the kind that holds heat without spectacle. Outside, his wolves were moving through the ridge, and somewhere on the slope Petra and Cell were watching, and the gray highland sky was turning toward afternoon. Then we start there, he said. The people who'd been hunting us were found by nightfall. They were not, as it turned out. The court wolves Drav had been watching at the gate. They were from a different house entirely, a branch of the old blood advisors who had spent years building influence in the court through quiet maneuvering and patient placement, who had been the architects of the first 3 attempts on Lysa's life, and who had decided when the nursery attempt failed that their best move was to ensure the child was never found. Kalen's wolves brought 3 of them to the treaty grounds in the last light of the afternoon. I stayed with Lysa in the stone building and listened to what happened outside, the voices, the weight of command authority, the silence that followed it. I didn't need to see it. I'd been hearing the story since the night in the Thornwood, a family with power it didn't want to lose, doing what families like that always do, treating a child as a problem to be solved, treating an Omega as a variable they didn't need to account for. They'd been wrong about that last part. Kalen came back in the near dark with snow on his shoulders, and an expression that had been refined down to something cleaner than what I'd first seen. The complicated grief was still there, would be for a long time, I suspected, the grief of a man who had believed the wrong thing for too long, but the flatness behind it was gone. He sat down across the fire from me. Lysa had been asleep for an hour. I had her in the crook of my arm, and the warmth of the mark was the particular steady warmth it went to when she was sleeping, a patient, present content. It's done, he said. All of them. The 3 here, the rest my wolves know the names now. It will take time, but yes, all of them. I nodded. He watched the fire for a while, then he said, I want to ask you something. All right. The night you found her, the sound that turned you off the path. He was choosing his words with care. Did you know what it was? No. I heard something beneath the wind. Something I don't know. My wolf moved before I understood it, so I followed. Most wolves wouldn't have. Most wolves on that route are hoping to finish their patrol and go back to warm food. I paused. I was too. I wasn't being brave. I was just following a sound. You kept following it all the way here. I thought about the 9 days again. The highland, the frost, Lysa's small hands wrapped around my finger in the dark. I was going to put her down once she was safe, I said. That was the plan. Find her, warm her, hand her to someone ranked enough to handle what came next. I looked at Lysa, but she held on to my finger. And by morning the plan had changed. He made a small sound that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh. She does that, he said. She's been doing it since she was born, holding on. She's very good at it. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Her mother was too. He said it without the careful management he'd used earlier for anything that touched grief, said it plainly, the way you say things that are true and that you've decided to stop hiding. She held on to things, ideas, people. It made her difficult sometimes, and extraordinary. I didn't say anything, I just let it sit. I should warn you, he said after a while, that the court is going to have a great deal of opinions about you. An omega with a mating mark and a found child. Yes, I imagine they will. Some of them are going to be hostile. I've been managing hostile for most of my life. It tends to be louder than it is effective. He looked at me. You're not afraid of it. I was afraid for a long time, I said. I think I'm done with that particular practice. I paused. I might find new things to be afraid of. I'll report back. This time the sound he made was definitely a laugh, brief and real, the kind that happens before a person has decided whether to allow it. I looked at him across the fire. He looked back at me. The mark was warm. Lysa was asleep. Outside, the highland wind moved through the gray dark in the particular way it did at altitude, not hostile, not gentle, just present, just the world being what it was. He leaned forward and set another piece of wood on the fire with the care of someone doing something with their hands, because it helps them think. Sparks lifted and settled into the dark. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The sound, the one that turned you off the patrol path." He looked at the fire rather than at me. "You said your wolf moved before you understood it. Has she ever done that before? Moved toward something specific without you knowing why?" I thought about it. The honest answer required thinking carefully. "Once," I said, "when I was 12. I was carrying firewood across the yard and my wolf went still in the way she does when something is wrong, not a threat, just wrong. I set the firewood down and went to look. There was a pup half buried under a collapsed woodpile at the back of an outbuilding. Nobody had heard her. Nobody noticed she was missing." I paused. "She was fine. I got her out. She was 8 weeks old, maybe." "You've always been this," he said quietly, "long before the mark." I wasn't sure what to do with that, so I didn't do anything. I sat with it. "I was told when I was young that the Alpha King's mark fell on the strongest wolf," he said. "The one with the most power, the most visible force. My father believed it. The protocol is built around it, rank alignment, because strength was assumed to be readable in rank." He looked at me. "But that's not what the mark is." "I don't know what the mark is," I said. "I think it finds the truest wolf, not the loudest. Not the highest ranked. The one who turns off the path when something is wrong, without needing a reason. The one who carries things across a highland range because they need to be carried." He was watching me with the careful, present attention he'd had since the stone room, not measuring, just looking. The distinction mattered. The one who stops being afraid somewhere on a frost-covered ridge and decides to just keep moving. "I was always going to keep moving," I said. "I just didn't know it yet." He made a small sound, not quite the laugh, something steadier. "She won't always be this small," I said. "Lysa. She's going to grow up and argue with both of us and run the court and make us explain ourselves at least twice a year." "Almost certainly." "And the court politics. Some of the people deciding right now which way to position themselves are going to choose wrong, and that's going to take managing." "Yes." "And the formal dinners. There are apparently a great many of them, and I have never attended one in my life." He made the laugh sound fully this time, brief and real. "There are. I find most of them tedious. You'll have an advantage in not having learned to pretend otherwise." I looked at him across the fire. He looked back at me. The coals had settled into the steady, patient heat of something that has found its shape and intends to keep it. "I'm not the wolf anyone expected," I said. "No, you're the wolf the moon chose." He paused. "Those two things have almost never been the same. I'm glad they're not." Outside, the wind shifted, a small change in direction, the way it does at altitude when the weather is thinking about something new. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. We spent one more night at Keld Ridge, which Kaelin's wolves used to secure the road south, and Petra and Sel used to sleep properly for the first time in 9 days. I sat up late with Lysa, who had found a second wind around midnight, and spent 2 hours exploring the stone room with the thoroughness of a military inspection before finally consenting to sleep. I used the time to think. The mark was settled now in a way it hadn't been those first days in Asheville, still warm, still present, but without the startling pulse of something newly arrived. More like a conversation I'd been having so long it had become part of how I thought. I'd known mated wolves in the Asheville pack, wolves who'd found their fated partners through the traditional channels of proximity and bonding ceremonies, and the slow gravity of two lives pulling toward the same orbit. They described the mark's arrival as recognition, like a word you already knew appearing in a language you hadn't realized you were speaking. Standing in the snow, I hadn't recognized anything. I'd only felt the burn and the weight and the absurdity of the situation. But something had shifted in 9 days and 1 stone room, and a fire burned down to good coals, and what I felt now was less absurd and more present. A thing that existed in the same world I was standing in, rather than in some other story entirely. I knew better than to say any of that out loud yet. Lysa made a small sleep sound, something between a sigh and a complaint. I tucked the blanket more firmly around her and watched her face in the low firelight, the particular fierce serenity of a sleeping baby who has decided everything is exactly as it should be. "You're the most complicated thing that's ever happened to me," I told her quietly. She didn't wake, but she turned her head toward my voice, which I had learned was a thing she did. We rode out the next morning under a sky that had finally decided to clear, blue and hard, and clean the way winter sky gets when the clouds have said everything they have to say. Petra and Sel rode on my flanks. Kaelin's wolves ranged ahead and behind in the formation of a real escort, not the cautious minimum of a Borderlands pack alpha sending his omega across a highland range, but the full, deliberate guard of a king who had decided that what he was bringing home mattered. I noticed that, I didn't comment on it. Lysa, strapped against my chest in the sling, was awake and observing the landscape with the focused attention she brought to everything new. She made periodic small sounds of investigation. She had decided, overnight, that Kaelin's jawline was also worth exploring, which had led to a morning of her reaching between us at intervals, requiring a level of proximity that both of us were handling with carefully maintained equanimity. We were perhaps 2 hours out from Keld Ridge, moving through the long highland descent toward the tree line, when he rode up alongside me. He didn't say anything at first. We rode in the particular silence of two people who have said the important things and are now simply being present with what they've said. "Etta," he said eventually, "my wolves reached her last night at the North Waypoint. She's well." "Good. She wants to see Lysa when we arrive." "She should. She saved her life." He nodded. He was quiet again for a moment. "The court will want a formal presentation of Lysa's survival. They'll want protocol, ceremony." "I know." "Your rank," he started carefully. "The formal structure of the court doesn't have a I'm telling you that I'm going to have to navigate this deliberately, that there will be steps and politics and people who will be difficult. I'm not apologizing for that. I'm just telling you so you know I'm not ignoring it." "I didn't assume you'd ignore it." "No," he glanced at me. "You apologized for things you didn't need to apologize for, back in the stone building, and you didn't apologize for the things that were actually complicated. That's usually a reasonable indicator of how a person handles difficult navigation. He was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific observation. I've had a great deal of practice watching how people with power manage the things they'd rather not deal with. It's a useful skill for someone in my position. And what did you conclude? That you're going to do this properly, that it's going to take longer than either of us would like, and that you'll find it annoying when the protocol moves slower than you want it to. I paused. And that you're going to ask my opinion about the court more often than court tradition generally calls for, and that some of your advisors are going to have strong feelings about that. He was looking at me with an expression that was partly amused and partly something more careful. You're very certain of all that? I have the mark of the Alpha King on my neck, and I spent 9 days in the Highland deciding to stop being afraid. It makes a person confident. Lysa reached between us. Kalen, without breaking stride, shifted his horse slightly closer and let her take his finger. She curled her hand around it with the absolute satisfaction of someone whose demands have been correctly anticipated. He looked down at her. She's going to be trouble, he said. She already is. She's going to grow up and run everything. I know, I adjusted the sling. I'm looking forward to it. The tree line came up to meet us, and the wind at our backs had the particular quality of something that has been waiting for permission to move, purposeful, directional, carrying us forward into the particular shape of whatever came next. It took 3 more days to reach the court. I had never been to a royal court before. I had formed an impression based on the things you learn when you are low-ranked and invisible, that courts were places of marble and weight, where every room carried the architecture of importance, where people moved in patterns designed to communicate rank before they opened their mouths. I had formed this impression largely from overhearing Drav speak with the occasional high-ranked visitor to Asheville, and from the quality of the horses those visitors rode, the kind of horses that cost more than my entire year's labor. The reality of the Alpha King's court was larger than my impression, and more complicated. It sat at the end of a long valley, backed against a mountain range that turned the afternoon light gold even in winter. Stone buildings in the old style, which meant heavy and deliberate and built to last for generations rather than to impress any single season. A great hall with windows, the height of 2 wolves standing. Gatehouses on 3 sides and a courtyard large enough to hold a packed council comfortably. The people at the gate recognized Kalen before he reached them. I watched the ripple of it, the shift in posture, the immediate reorganization of attention, heads turning, the quiet, rapid movement of a court that has learned to read arrivals before they arrive. Then they saw me. I had been warned. Kalen had told me, Petra had told me, and Sel had said nothing, but his jaw had done the eloquent thing it did when he was being politely restrained. An omega in the escort position, an omega with a mark on her neck that anyone with eyes could read from 10 paces, because I had decided in the Highland that hiding it was a form of apology I wasn't prepared to offer. An omega carrying the Alpha King's heir against her chest in a travel sling like she'd been doing it her entire life. The ripple changed quality, became something with more edges. Kalen rode straight through it. He didn't pause at the gate or qualify anything. He rode in with the deliberate ease of a man who has considered every response to his actions, and found that the consideration is other people's work, not his. He called 2 of his wolves by name and directed them to specific tasks in the tone of someone resuming a conversation that had only been briefly interrupted. I rode in beside him. The first person to speak was a man I learned later was called Advisor Trent, old blood, white-haired, with the particular quality of someone who had spent 40 years being listened to and had developed a permanent expectation of it. He was at the gate before we dismounted, and he addressed Kalen with the practiced deference of his rank and the practiced resistance of someone who had decided to push while seeming to bow. My king, welcome back. His eyes moved to me, to the sling to my neck. I see you've brought guests. I've brought my daughter, Kaelin said. He was already off his horse, and the wolf who brought her back to me. The child, Trent stopped. His expression did a rapid, controlled revision. She's alive. She is. And this, another pause. The word he was not saying sat in the air between us with considerable presence. She's Omega ranked. She is. My king, the court protocols regarding mating marks in the case of rank disparity are very specific. I know the protocols. Kaelin turned to look at Trent directly, with the same plain attention he'd given everything else since the stone room, and I watched Trent experience what I had experienced, the full, undiluted weight of the king's regard when he had decided to stop managing himself. I wrote several of them, and I know which ones are going to need revision. He glanced at me. A brief glance, but Trent saw it and understood it. See that the east wing is prepared. And find out where Edda arrived. I want to know before the evening meal. He walked away into the court with the steady unhurry of a man whose stride is not a performance. Trent looked at me. I looked back at him. He had 40 years of experience and the architecture of importance behind him. I had a mark on my neck and a baby against my chest and 9 days in the Highland. We held the look for a moment, and then Trent turned and went into the court without speaking, which I counted as a small victory. Petra appeared at my elbow. That went better than I expected, she said. The day isn't over, I said. The east wing was warm and well appointed in the understated way of very old courts. Everything chosen for quality and duration, rather than display. The kind of rooms that have been useful to enough people over enough years that usefulness has become their primary language. Edda was there when I arrived. She looked better than she had the night she reached Asheville, fed, rested, less haunted by the distance in her eyes, though the distance wasn't entirely gone. She was standing at the far end of the room, and when I came through the door with Lysa, she went very still. I crossed the room and let her take Lysa, which she did with the careful reverence of someone who has believed they'd lost a thing, and is not yet fully persuaded they've found it again. She held the baby against her chest and pressed her lips together tightly and said nothing for a long time. She's well, I said. I can see. Edda's voice was controlled and low. She got bigger. It's only been 3 weeks and she got bigger. She eats a great deal, I said. And she has opinions about it. Edda made a sound that was half laugh and half something older. Her mother was the same. From the day she could gesture, she could tell you exactly when the food wasn't right. She looked up at me. Her eyes moved to my neck with the same brief, weighted attention that everyone in this court seemed to have, but in Edda's eyes it was different, softer. The moon chose well, she said. I didn't know what to say to that. I said, she's stubborn, Lysa. She held on through that night, through everything. Yes, Edda said, that's the bloodline. She looked down at Lysa again, who was awake and examining Edda's face with the focused gravity of a very thorough archivist. And the heart. The formal presentation was 3 days later. Kaelin had spent those 3 days doing the work of a king, who had returned from a border meeting with a great deal more than he'd left with, the quiet, systematic work of identifying who in his court had known about the attempts on Lysa's life and stayed silent, who had been complicit, who had been afraid, and who had genuinely not known. He did it with the same plain directness I'd watched him apply to everything, moving through the court politics the way he'd moved through the stone room at Keld Ridge, steadily, without theater. Advisor Trent, it turned out, had not been among the conspirators. He had been among the afraid. When Kaelin made that determination, he told Trent plainly, and Trent spent approximately 4 hours being privately shaken before emerging from his quarters to request an audience that lasted the better part of an afternoon. I didn't know what was said. I only knew that afterward Trent's 40 years of practiced resistance had shifted into something more considered. He found me in the east courtyard on the second afternoon, where I'd taken Lysa for air. He stood at a formal distance and said, "The mark. It appeared the night she was found." "Yes." "You didn't seek it?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Lysa with the expression of an old man who has been thinking through something very carefully and has arrived somewhere he didn't expect. "I've served 3 kings," he said. "I have seen 2 mating marks appear, both times on wolves of aligned rank. The protocol exists because rank alignment was considered a practical necessity, not a rule of the moon but a rule of courts." He paused. "The moon, as it turns out, has not consulted the protocol." "Evidently not." He looked at me. I was wrong in my reaction at the gate. I waited to see if there was more. He seemed to feel it was complete. I said, "I appreciate that." He nodded once and walked back into the court. Petra, who had been near the archway, materialized at my shoulder. Was that the old advisor making an apology to an Omega? "Apparently." "Things," Petra said, "are different here than they were a week ago." "Yes," I said. "They are." The presentation hall was full. Full in the way that courts get full when something unprecedented is happening, and everyone has decided that being present is more important than being dignified about why. Kalen stood at the center of the room with the particular stillness I'd come to recognize as his version of patience, present, contained, watching everything. He had Lysa in his arms, and she was examining the hall with the fierce archivist's attention she brought to everything, occasionally reaching for something that caught her eye. I stood 3 paces to his left. Mated wolves stood at the Alpha Kings, right during formal presentations. Unmated wolves, even marked wolves, stood to the left, a distinction the protocol preserved, while the larger question remained formally open. Kalen had explained this to me the night before with the careful neutrality of a man laying out a situation he intended to change but wasn't changing yet, and I had said I understood, which I did. The room was doing what rooms full of court wolves do when an Omega is standing 3 paces from the Alpha King with his mark on her neck. A particular quality of assessing silence, broken by the occasional sound of people deciding which way to position themselves before anything official had been said. Kalen spoke. He was very good at this. I had understood that in the stone room, but the presentation hall made it plain. The room went fully quiet before he'd said 3 words, not from command presence but from the specific gravity of someone saying a true thing. He told them Lysa was alive. He told them she had been taken from the nursery by a servant at personal risk and carried to safety in the borderlands. He told them she had been found in the Thornwood by a patrol wolf of the Asheville pack, a wolf whose name was Senna, and that the moon had placed his mark on that wolf on the night she touched his daughter. The silence afterward was the particular kind that means a room full of people have all reached the same understanding at the same moment, and are now negotiating, privately and rapidly, what they're going to do about it. Someone at the back of the room, a young wolf, mid-ranked, with the slightly defiant energy of someone who has just decided to be brave, began to applaud. It rippled forward, slowly at first, then with more certainty, the way things move when a room has been waiting for permission. Lysa, from Kaelin's arms, looked at the room with the expression she wore when she was considering whether to be pleased or unimpressed. Then she turned and reached for me, with the imperious absolute certainty she always deployed. Kaelin smiled. It was a small smile, real and not performed, the kind that happens before a person can catch it. He passed her to me. The applause continued. I held Lysa against my chest and stood in the presentation hall with the Alpha King's mark warm on my neck and his daughter's fist wrapped around my collar, and I did not lower my eyes, and I was not afraid. The mark on my neck was warm. Lysa's hand was around Kaelin's finger, and somewhere ahead, past the tree line and the lowlands and the long court roads I'd never traveled, A door was open. I had followed a sound beneath the wind into the snow and found a baby with ancient dark eyes and frostbite on 3 fingers, and she had held on to me, and I had held on back, and the moon had written something on my skin that I was still learning to read. But I was done being afraid of the reading. The evening of the presentation, after the hall had cleared and the court had gone back to its rooms with its theories and its rapid recalibrations, Kalen found me in the east courtyard again. Not looking for me exactly. It was the path to the eastern gardens, and he walked it in the evenings, I had learned, when the day had been long. But he stopped when he saw me. Lysa was awake, propped against my arm, conducting a comprehensive study of the torchlight. She had an opinion about torchlight clearly, though what exactly it was remained unclear. Kalen sat down on the stone bench beside me, not close, not distant, present. "Trent told me he spoke with you," he said. "He did. He said you were gracious." He made an apology he didn't have to make. It deserved a gracious response. Most people in your position would have been less gracious. Most people in my position were taught to be grateful for small acknowledgments. I've been learning to distinguish between grateful and gracious. They're not the same thing. I paused. Grateful implies you didn't expect it. Gracious implies you did. He was quiet for a moment. "The court is going to be interesting with you in it." "I imagine it will be." Lysa reached upward with sudden decision and grabbed a fold of my collar, tugging with the focused determination she brought to all physical challenges. I let her pull, and she worked at it for a while, satisfied by the effort. "She's never done that with anyone else," Kalen said. "Let someone hold her through a whole evening without becoming unhappy about it. She did it with Marin on the 3rd day. She tolerates Marin." Tolerates is a strong word for a person who cannot yet speak. It's the right word. Lysa has a very distinct tolerates face. I looked down at the baby, who had moved on from my collar and was now examining my thumb. She'll tolerate a great many people as she grows up. She'll like some of them, she'll love very few. And which category am I in? I considered that. "You're her father," I said. "That's a separate category. You don't have to earn it, it just is." I paused. "The other categories take longer." "What category are you in?" he asked. I looked at Lysa. She looked up at me with the ancient dark eyes that had looked at me in the snow on the first night, measuring, deciding. "She reached for me," I said. "She held on before she had any reason to, before I'd done anything to earn it. I thought about 9 days and a highland range and the fading of an old, particular fear. I think that's its own category." Kalen was quiet for a long moment. The torchlight moved across the courtyard stones, finding the textures in them, the wear of years, the patience of something built to last. "The protocol," he said, "allows for a formal recognition of a mating mark in cases where the mark has been confirmed by both parties." He said it carefully, with the particular care of a man saying something that has real weight and wants to make sure that weight is acknowledged. Not a claiming, not a bonding, a recognition. A formal acknowledgement that the mark exists and that both wolves have accepted that it exists. He paused. "It's the beginning of a longer process. It doesn't compel anything." "I know what recognition means," I said. "Do you want it?" I thought about what I'd said to him in the stone room at Keld Ridge. Not claiming and not wanting aren't necessarily the same thing. "Yes," I said. He exhaled. It was a very quiet exhalation, the kind that means something was being held and is now, carefully, not. Lysa, with the timing that I suspected she was going to deploy with devastating precision for the rest of her life, chose this moment to reach between us with both hands. I looked at her, Kalen looked at her, we both looked at each other. "She does have opinions," he said. "About everything," I agreed. I kept writing. The court behind us, the valley ahead, Lysa between us with her hands reaching for both, and the mark warm and steady and present on my neck like a word in a language I was learning, sentence by sentence, to speak.